Mesachas Gittin Daf Pei Hey. We begin with the Mishnah near the top of the Daf. We'll have one additional Mishnah dividing the Daf into two sugyas. The first sugya is a continuation of our last Mishnah discussing if a man gives his wife a get with an exception. When does that exception, when is that limitation to the divorce possible the get, when does it not? The Mishnah will have some examples, two primary categories of examples, and then the Gemara will have a list of other scenarios and questions which it will leave mostly as teiku, not answers. Let's begin. So the first Mishnah says, as we've seen before in our last Mishnah, if a man divorces his wife, it says except for that person, you're not divorced relative to that individual, meaning she's still not allowed to marry him. Concerning that person, she's still considered to be an Eshes sister of the first husband. So we had seen that that's a psul in the get because it still leaves conditions, it still leaves remnants of her first marriage. So the Mishnah here says that that's irrelevant if it's somebody that she couldn't have tfisas kedushin on anyway, but it is relevant if it's someone that she's not allowed to marry, but she has tfisas kedushin, because this is asering, this is making a situation where there's no tfisas kedushin. So the Mishnah says, if he says you are now permitted to all people except for your father or my father or your brother or my brother or to an eved or to an eved kichavim, or anybody else that does not have tfisas kedushin, the get is valid. Now, if, however, he says you're permitted to everybody except for if you're an almana to a kain gadol, if you're a grusha or a chalusa to a kain hedyet, mamzeres, or a nesina to yisrael, bas yisrael to a mamzer or to a nesin, or anybody that has kedushin, even though it's kedushin that's in avera, that get is puzzled because it is making it forbidden for her to marry somebody. So his condition is, his exception is having an effect, and therefore it's no good. So Mara first points out, why is there a rule? Why is there a sum up? Anybody that has no tfisas kedushin, anybody who has tfisas kedushin. So anybody who has no tfisas kedushin, that's to include other chayve krisis, other types of marriages that incur kares, which is no tfisas kedushin on, according to most opinions. There is a list that's not mentioned here. And the second rule, anyone who has tfisas kedushin is an exception that apostles to get. That's to include other types of chayve lavin, which you could have a mayni, me'avi, nesini, mitzri, ademi, and all these things. All right, now the Gemara has a list of questions. Rava asks Rav Nachman. So what's if he says, you're divorced, you're free to everybody except for this person, and that person is a katan. A katan can't marry her anyway. So at the time that he's saying this, she is permitted to marry everybody that she's able to. However, that katan is going to grow up at some point, and then it'll be forbidden. So do you say that at this moment she's free to everybody and there's no conditions in the get, or do you say no, there is, ultimately there will be? So he answered, and he said, we learned in answer to that. We have a brisa that says that a kitana, that is a girl who is a kitana, if she gets married off by her father could be makabel kedushin for her, now she's married deraisa, then the father dies, so she could still be makabel her own gerushin. She could get divorced by herself receiving the get, even though she herself can only receive a get, apparently midrabanan, and her father could receive, and her father married her off midaraisa, it's still a valid get. So the Gemara's question is, how is it possible that that's valid? We have a hakash between v'yatza v'hoisa, and we should say that somebody cannot be divorced unless she's able to be married. She can't marry herself off. A kana can't be a makabel kedushin for herself deraisa. How could she be makabel a get for herself deraisa? Obviously, we say that she could be makabel a get for herself because she could eventually be makabel kedushin for herself. Even though at this age she can't, since she's a type of person who could be makabel kedushin for herself, she could be makabel get for herself as well. Therefore, we do say that the fact that it's going to occur in the future makes it relevant. So here also we should be able to say that even though this person that she's not allowed to marry because of this get is not suitable for marriage at some point, but is suitable for marriage eventually, and therefore that does count as if he would be suitable, and therefore this get is forbidding it, and therefore the get has an exception to it, and therefore there's a psul in the get itself. That's how Rav Nachman answered that question. Now the next question is, what if he didn't say a child, you're not allowed to marry a child, you're divorced with the exception of a child? He said you're divorced with the exception of an unborn child, someone who's not born yet. Do you say that that's considered to be not making any difference at this point because he's not even born? Or do you say no, because it's going to make a difference when the child is born? So I want to bring right to that. Also from an eved and kechavim, where where that's not considered to be a psul because he can't marry her anyway. So the question is, well, hold on a second, when an eved and kechavim could convert and that it will make a difference, even though they're not suitable for marriage now, but that could change. So this unborn child is also not suitable for marriage now, but that could change. Yet you see that Isser on the Eved and the Eved Kechavim does not count as an exception to the get, so that prevention of the unborn child should also not count as a prevention to the get. So the Gemara argues on this one. The Gemara says unborn children are usually born. Eved and Kechavim don't usually convert. So there is an automatic assumption that an unborn child is going to come to birth, and therefore you're preventing something. This get is preventing something which is likely to happen. That's much a bigger problem than preventing an Eved, her from marrying an Eved and Kechavim on the off chance that he will convert. Now, the Gemara says, okay, we'll accept that, but what happens in a similar situation, which we could compare much more easily to Eved and Kechavim, and that's if he says that you can't marry the one person that there's an exception to is her sister's husband. Now, her sister's husband is only us to her as long as her sister is alive and married to him. If she gets divorced or she dies, then that husband becomes mutter to her. So do you say, well, it's possible the sister's going to die, and therefore she'll become mutter, and this get is therefore has an exception, is making a difference, and it's a problem? And do you say it won't? So again, you can say the same thing. Well, the Eved and Kechavim are not marriageable at this point, and we say that that's not considered to be the get blocking them, even though they could convert. So we should say the same thing. The sister is also not considered to be blocking, even though she could die, and that would allow the sister's husband to marry her. So the Gemara says not necessarily, you can't really compare the two. Conversion is not something that happens often, but a death of a person happens pretty often, so therefore it's still more likely that would be a difference than the Eved and the Eved Kechavim. The Gemara now introduces another list of exceptions. The Gemara wants to know whether these count as an exception that makes a difference, and therefore the get is considered incomplete and it's invalid. So the first one is if he says you're divorced with the exception of znus, meaning that if you're not allowed to, with regard to any znus, any bia that you might do outside of a marriage, you're not divorced relative to that, and that becomes an isser krisis now. You're an ishis ish as far as that's concerned. So the Gemara asks, does that not called an exception in the get because it's not blocking any marriage, it's just blocking a ma'aseh bia, it's making it more chamor? Or do we say, no, that is considered significant? So the Gemara wants to bring a proof to that too. The Gemara says, if you look in the Mishnah, it says that he said to her that if you're divorced with exception of my father or your father, that's not considered to be an exception. That means my father and your father obviously is talking about a bia, it's not talking about a nesuin, because there is no marriage. There's no possibility of marriage there. So it's talking about a bia, and yet it's only my father and your father that's not considered to be changing anything. However, if it would be another person, it would be considered an exception, and that would passel the get. So that should prove that it is a problem. So the Gemara says, no, maybe it wasn't talking about a bia, it was talking about a nesuin, even though a nesuin is not typeface. He's telling her that there's no, if you would choose to do a nesuin, that would be an exception, and that's why we paskin that it makes no difference, and it's not a real exception to the get, because there's no tefisas in the suin anyway. Now, the Gemara's next question is, what if he says to her, you're divorced with the exception of a bia that you're going to do shaloi kidarka? So is that called an exception or not, or shaloi kidarka not called a real bia? So the Gemara says it is. It's a question, is it or is it not? Do we say that there's no blockage of a real bia, or do we say that the Torah puts real kedarka and shalei kedarka together, they'll link to each other with the term mishkevei isha, plural, and therefore they have to have the same halachas? Next question, the Gemara asks, what if he says you're divorced with the exception of hafaras nedarim, I still retain the right to be made for your neder? Do we say that there's no exception to her marriageability, or do we say that since the right to hafaras nedarim belongs to someone's husband, he's still leaving himself as a husband, so that is a problem, it is an exception to the get, so it's a limitation which passels the get. That's because it says isha yeferenu, it's only a husband who has the right to do hafara. Same thing if he says you're divorced with the exception that you can't eat truma if you marry a kohen. Again, is that not an exception to her marriageability, or is it because the right to eat truma goes along with marriage? It's called kinyan kaspai. That's the kohen gives that right to eat truma to any kinyan kaspai. Next, as far as if he insists that he's going to inherit her even though he divorces her, is that also considered to be not an exception to marriage, or do we say it is because it says she'eroi, that one's flesh, one's family inherits, and that refers to the spouse? The next question the Gemara asks, if he says, if you're divorced with the exception of any kedushin you'll do with a shtar, is that called an exception because it limits her ways of being able to be niskadesh, or do we say no because she could always be mekadesh one of the other ways, bekesef or bibia, or do we say no, the Torah says v'yotzav ha'isa, and therefore she has to be able to do all of them? And the Gemara leaves these questions all as a teku, the question stands and is unanswered. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what line is the essence of the get itself, both a get isha and a get shechar. So for the get isha, it's a machlokes. We have the Tanakama who says the ikar line is harayat mutar s'chal adam, you permit it to every man. And Yehuda who says the ikar line is as follows. It says Vidan dahavi lechem yinoi sefer tirichun v'geras shvulkin v'get beturin lemehach leis nisava l'chol gavra deyis v'tain. And he says this is for you a book of separation, a letter of freedom, a document of cancellation, in order that you should be able to marry any man that you desire. Now, as far as a get shikhr, to free an eved, so there are two possible lines: Harei at bascheirin, you are free, or Harei at la'atzmech, you are belonging to yourself. Now the Gemara asks what happens if you mix up a get shikhr and a get isha. So the Gemara begins. The Gemara says if he writes for his wife a language that belongs in a get shikhr, he writes Harei at bascheirin, you are a free woman. So that's meaningless, because to say that she's free, she doesn't have to work. She was never had to work, so that hasn't changed anything. And to say that she's free to marry whoever she wants, that is not what's implied by freedom. The word chiros, freedom, doesn't apply to divorce. So that for sure doesn't work. The question is, what about the opposite? What if he writes for a shivcha, harayat mutaras l'chol adam, you are now permitted to everybody? So that's not true either. She's not. As long as she's a shivcha, she's only permitted to marry an eved. And he hasn't told her that she's free from working and she's not a shivcha anymore. Now, what if he writes for his wife, he says, Harayat la'atzmech, you now belong to yourself. So do we say that he means you belong to yourself as far as you don't belong to me anymore, there's no marriage involved? Or do you say that it only refers to work and therefore it's no good? So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, you bring a proof from a Mishnah where it says that the essence of a get shikhr is harayat baschei and harei la'atzmech, and if there works for an eved where he didn't own the guf and he could just say harayat la'atzmech, so certainly it should work for an isha. If it works for an eved, that is where he owned the guf and he could just say harayat la'atzmech, it certainly works for an isha where he didn't actually own her and she's just saying that you're fully yours. Now, the Gemara now says further, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, if somebody says to his eved, I have nothing to do with you, only asek bach, I have nothing to do with you, does that work as a language of freedom or not? So Rav Chanan then said to Rav Ashi, and some say Rav Chanan of Chozna said to Rav Ashi, he could bring a proof from a brisa that says if somebody sells his eved to an eved kechavim, the halacha is, first of all, he has to redeem him, he even has to pay 10 times the value, but he cannot work him any longer. He goes free as a penalty for him selling someone who has the halachic status of a Jew to an kechavim. So therefore he has to give him a get shikhr. Now, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that's only true if he didn't write oinoi. But if he wrote oinoi, that automatically counts as a shikhr. He doesn't have to write another shikhr. So what's oinoi? So Gemara says oinoi is a shtar where he writes in it, if you run away from your new owner, I have nothing to do with you. I'm not going to reclaim you. So you see that the phrase, I have nothing to do with you, is a valid freedom, is a valid shikhr. The Gemara now explains the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim as to whether he has to say, Vidon dahavi lechi, and this is for you, this is what creates the freedom, this is the book of the freedom. So Gemara says the machlokes is about the concept of yidayim she'ein mechiches, where something is indicated but it's not proven. So if he didn't say Vidon, then it's indicated that he means for this get to divorce her, but it could be not. It could be that he means that he's divorcing her by saying you're free, and the get is just a document to prove that that happened later, but that's not what's actually making it. Although that's not the most logical or likely explanation of what he means to do, it's not Yadayim Mechichos. It's not proven. It's Yadayim She'en Mechichos. So Rabbi Yehuda holds Yadayim She'en Mechichos is not enough. You have to have it proven, and therefore it has to say in the get, and this is. With the Rabbanan, Yadayim She'en Mechichos is enough. It doesn't have to say it in the get. We know that's what he meant. The Gemara now speaks a little bit about the particulars of spelling in the get. We actually spell some words in an unusual way in order to emphasize the correct pronunciation, because if it would be pronounced in the wrong way, if it written as it's spelled normally, it could be pronounced wrong, and that would have the wrong meaning. So Abaye says, when he says vidain, that is to say, and this is, he should not write vidin with a yud, which should normally be pronounced vidain, but he should write vidain without a yud, because if it's read as vidin, then he would mean to say instead of, and this is the get, he could be saying that the rule is I should be giving you a get, but he's denying that he's actually giving it, which would mean a wrong implication. That would mean she's not divorced. Next one, he says igeres, which is normally written with a yud after the aleph. He should not write it with that yud, because that would be pronounced as igeres, meaning a roof. Instead, it should be as ageres, as a letter without the yud. When he writes limehach, he shouldn't pronounce it. It should not be spelled with a yud after the lamed. Limehach. Because that would be read as li mehach, that you are mine from now, meaning you are mine from this forward, which is the opposite implication as the get. In the same word, you should also be careful that the hey is clearly a hey and not a ches, because limachech with a ches would mean to laugh at you, that he's laughing at her. Again, it's the wrong implication. Next one, he says the hishavyon and the yisyatzivion. He's saying that you can be married to whom you want. You can be married to whom you want. Should be spelled with 3 yuds and before the last nun. If it's spelled with only 2, it could be read as tehavain and titzvain, which means that women generally couldn't get married to who they want, but it doesn't refer to you specifically. Now you also have to emphasize the vav. You have to make sure that it's clearly a vav and doesn't look like a yud. And the words teruchin and shavukin and kidu, because if it looks like a yud, it would be terichin, shavikin, and kidi. That would have the wrong implication again. Terichin and shavikin would be referring to women generally, not to you. And kidi would mean with nothing, meaning that you're not divorced with this get, you're just divorced with nothing, and that would also be the wrong implication. Okay. Next, the Gemara asks, Api halacha, do we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda or like the Rabbanan? Do you have to write the dain in the get? So the Gemara wants to bring a proof that Rava made a takana with a brayso. We have a sugya where Rava makes a takana in the get to write ach plania bar plania, so and so the son of so and so, pater v'tarach yas plunisa, in to say he set free and released this woman who was his wife, the havas into say min kadam, who was his wife from previously, denan from such and such day in which they got married, and from ever after. And in all this, it doesn't say vidain. That line isn't there. So you see, you don't have to say the whole vidain line. So you're asking me, there are many things that aren't in this takana. Rava was just adding something. He's saying add this line in. He wasn't saying that this is the only thing you write, because there's a lot of things left out. So you can't prove anything from there. The Gemara now explains a few of the halachos that Rava said. Why do we have to write this into the shtar of the get? Someone says you have to write miyuma denan from today. That is to avoid getting involved in machakas between Rabbi Yosi and others as to whether a get of a person who is dying has to say that it takes effect from today. That's if he's divorcing her because he's understanding that he's going to die. Does it have to be from today, or is it automatic since it has a date in it? It's assumed to be from today. Therefore, we write from today. Even though we pass like Rabbi Yosi, we write from today to avoid any such questions. Now you also have to write ula'olam and forever. That's to avoid Rava. That's to avoid the question that Rava asked from Nachman. If somebody says you're divorced today and not tomorrow, does that work? Does she become his wife again tomorrow? We paskin that does not work. She stays divorced forever. However, we want to avoid that issue as well. We don't want to have any laws on the get, and therefore you're right from today and forever. The Gemara now discusses certain rules that Rabbi Yehuda placed into a document of sale of an eved. When one person sells an eved to another, you have to establish certain things that can't be challenged later. So first of all, he has to say that he is for sure an eved. There is no claim that he's free. He is unencumbered by any freedoms or being removed from avdus. He doesn't have any complaints against him from others or from the kingdom. He doesn't have a brand of anybody on him who claims that he's his. The king has no criminal charges against him. If there's an Eved with criminal charge against him, that's a psul for avdus as well, and it invalidates the sale. He's free also of any types of blisters or boils or diseases. He's been free of them for the last 2 years. As I say that because these things, once they occur again within 2 years. Even if they leave, they come back within 2 years. So he has to make sure there weren't any within the last 2 years. And we're just note somebody who has those, whether the new ones or old ones, original or returning, what's secure for it. So Abai says he takes ginger, he takes the ore that comes out when you mine silver, and he takes sulfur and vinegar of wine and oil of olive oil. And then he takes white drips and he rubs it together with the feather of a goose.